They called them the ghosts of the battlefield, but these weren't spirits, they were real men, ordinary folk turned into lethal shadows by sheer force of will and wood. Their arrows? Whispered nightmares for armored enemies, but behind every shot was a cost few lived long enough to count. What if I told you that being a royal archer wasn't a reward, it was a sentence? Meet the Stormark Rangers, not nobles, not warlords, but farmers and stable boys trained to bring down knights with a single pull of the string. They were the iron fist of the Northern Highlands during the Ravenspire conflict, praised in tavern songs, feared in enemy prayers. Chronicles say their arrows could shatter plated armor like dry wood and fell men before their war cries echoed. But here's the truth, these victories were carved not just in blood, but in bone their own. Ever wondered what it really took for a hay-chewing peasant to become a state-sanctioned marksman? Was it glory, riches, parades through cheering crowds? Not quite. Behind the shimmer of legacy lay a brutal truth. Endless drills, destroyed bodies, lives spent in agony and sweat for a chance to make history or die before their name was ever known. The weapon they wielded, the Blackthorn warbow, wasn't just a tool, it was a beast. With a draw weight of over 130 pounds, it demanded more than skill, it demanded sacrifice. Imagine hours each day, year after year, pulling at that monstrous string until your spine gave way or your shoulders cracked. That bow fused with them muscle, mind, and marrow, and it broke them too. Archaeologists recently unearthed the remains of the Rangers buried in frost-shattered barrows near Daggerhearth Ridge. Their bones? Twisted, shoulders mangled, spines bent like old timber. Arthritis had turned their joints to stone before their 30th year. They didn't just train, they mutated. Boys, sometimes as young as 6, began their journey with reed bows. No toys, just practice tools for survival. As they grew, so did their burden-heavier bows, longer hours. And then came the Sunday law. Under the Thornridge Decree, games were outlawed, only war practice was allowed on rest days. Whole towns turned into living barracks. Markets cleared out. Fields became makeshift ranges. The bow was no longer a weapon, it was the national heartbeat. But with glory came the grind. Imagine palms torn open by the string, arms trembling every evening, the smell of sweat, damp hay, and blood in your nostrils. The training wasn't heroic, it was punishment disguised as discipline. The Blackthorn didn't just win battles, it aged its masters. They limped into adulthood, already weary like broken warhorses. And for what? In battle, they stood not behind kings, but in the front lines. No golden armor, just a ragged leather vest, maybe a chain-line gambeson if they were lucky. While nobles strutted in steel from head to toe, the Rangers wore cloth, dreams, and dread. Their helmets? Simple dome caps called crow shells, barely enough to deflect a wild swing, let alone a crossbow bolt. They were the chessboard pawns placed on the flanks, sent to pelt cavalry and cause chaos. If they fired first, they won. If they missed, they died. The enemy's archers and cannons saw them as easy pickings. Sometimes they planted sharpened pikes into the ground before them to repel horse charges. But if the riders came too fast, the stakes were as useful as twigs in a hurricane. Close combat? Disaster. When swords clashed and lines broke, the Rangers were the first to bleed. Light armor, no shields, and the knight bearing down on you had a warhammer the size of your skull. The tales from the Battle of Greyfall and the Siege of Morlight speak of rain turning red, fields soaked in groans, and arrows falling like cursed hail. Few who stood there walked away with both legs. The battlefield was chaos. Screams of wounded men mixed with the guttural cries of charging beasts. Smoke from fire-tar arrows choked the air. The clatter of metal, the whistle of arrows, the crashing of men. Rangers had to breathe through terror, aim through tremors, and follow commands over the roar of doom. And the war never ended after the clash. Once the killing stopped, another horror began. Retrieving arrows, dragging wounded friends through blood, muck, burying brothers whose faces no longer looked human. These memories didn't just haunt, they infected. Many Rangers lived with night terrors, muscle tremors, and broken spirits. Even those who survived the battles had death stalking their tent. Disease spread through the camp faster than any cavalry, or maybe it was an accidental arrow misfired in the heat, or frostbite during a winter campaign that turned toes black and dead. For many, death didn't come by sword, it came by rot, silence, or error. Yet the Stormark Rangers weren't suicidal madmen. They were cunning, smart, survivors. They knew how to use the battlefield like a chessboard. High ground was king. Hills, ditches, and forest edges became their refuge. Commanders drilled them to claim vantage points, fire from shadows, and vanish before return fire. Sometimes that wasn't enough. In flat terrain, the Rangers made their own cover. Sharpened stakes carried in bundles, driven into the earth at angles. A wall of splinters to halt a cavalry's charge. Enough time for one last volley. Or a hasty retreat. When things got ugly, and they often did, Rangers ducked low, crawled behind dead horses or fallen comrades. Desperate? Yes, but effective. Some even hid behind overturned wagons if the battlefield was near a supply train. Broken walls, crates, anything to buy a few seconds of life. Their skill wasn't just in shooting, it was in surviving. The best among them knew how to melt into the earth, read the wind, vanish behind a stump, and reappear a dozen paces away with a drawn string. Their officers weren't just tacticians, they were shepherds of shadows, guiding men through slaughter and back. But make no mistake, the Rangers' path wasn't paved in medals, it was written in blood, bent bone, and whispers. Every arrow they loosed carried not just death, but the echo of what it had cost to learn how to shoot it. The casualty numbers for the Windspire Rangers? Grim. These warriors weren't granted the luxury of lurking in the shadows. Their bows were the very backbone of their warband. They had to shoot, rain arrows like storms, all while staring death in the eye. There was no room for hesitation. Victory demanded exposure. And they answered again and again, with defiance etched into their knuckles. Diving behind a broken cart or slumping into a ditch wasn't cowardice, it was battlefield wisdom. These men weren't fools, they were survivors. Every volley was a wager, a gamble in a violent chess game where one slip meant a tombstone. Their choices where to stand, when to fire, when to duck were made in milliseconds and paid in blood. Now imagine what they wore into this chaos. Not shimmering plate armor or gilded cloaks, but patched up gear that looked more like something sewn by a blind tailor and a desperate blacksmith. The common ranger's get-up, a stitched iron leaf jerkin, layered linen padded with horsehair, stuffed with torn wool, even scraps of old tunics. Some had it reinforced with narrow steel slats hidden beneath the cloth. These were the bone coats, heavy but life-saving sometimes. Helmets ranged from beaten iron caps, dome guards. They called them to full snout visors known as whistle helms, named for the eerie sound they made in the wind. Protection was practical, not pretty. A leather bracer wrapped the bow arm to prevent the cord from slicing flesh open. The string-pulling hand? Often gloved in thick hide or wrapped with horn-lined mitts, clumsy, but better than raw wounds. Every ranger also carried a side weapon just in case a blade slipped through their defenses. Some swore by daggers shaped like skewers, stick fangs. Others favored short swords, rusted axes, or weighted cudgels that doubled as walking sticks. Their arsenal wasn't issued, it was scavenged, bartered, or forged by the village smith. Beneath the armor was a scratchy linen shirt, worn wool trousers, and leather-studded clogs, or stiff boots that rubbed blisters the size of pebbles. On frigid nights, they'd throw on a rough woolen cloak, usually soaked, sometimes shared. None of it looked noble, but all of it had a purpose: survive one more day. Their daily reality? Brutal. Sleeping under stars, on damp ground, with nothing but a soaked cloak and maybe a pile of straw for warmth. If the unit was lucky, very lucky, they'd set up canvas tents. But mostly, the sky was their roof. Cold seeped into their bones, hunger hollowed their guts, and even sleep betrayed them with dreams of battle. Cleanliness? A fantasy. Hygiene in camp was a running joke, and the punchline was always dysentery. The bows demanded constant attention. They couldn't get wet, the strings needed waxing or replacing, and each arrow had to be straight, fletched, and razor sharp. If not, it could snap in your hand or miss its mark when your life depended on it. Armor rusted, boots tore, gloves frayed, and still the ranger marched. This gear wasn't just protection, it was their curse. It gave them a fighting chance, but it also meant endless chores, repairs, and aches. A second skin, yes, but one made of thorns. Campaign life was no less merciless. The War of Cindertide dragged on for decades, and rangers crossed icy rivers and burnt valleys far from their marshy homeland. They walked, always walked. Through cracked hills, bogs, and snow plains. The weight on their backs, weapons, food sacks, maybe a flask could reach 40 pounds or more. One ranger's journal, a rare find from a man named Garrick Thorne, reads, "My legs burned, my boots bled. But I kept moving, for stopping meant death from blade, bandit, or frost. To fall behind was to vanish. Some disappeared. Some were found frozen under tree roots. and no one waited. Discipline? Ruthless. You misstep, you vanish. You desert, you hang. There was no room for mercy. During evenings, if they weren't shivering beneath sleet, they gathered near weak fires, careful not to attract enemy scouts. Most nights, they couldn't even risk that. Water was dirty, food was spoiled, rats sometimes outnumbered rations, men fell ill, stomach rot, fevers, coughing blood, the latrines, trenches that stank worse than the dead. One outbreak could wipe out a whole column before the next clash. Injury was its own executioner. Infection spread like wildfire. If you were lucky, a healer with a blunt blade might carve the rot away. More often, you just stop waking up. Gangrene took fingers, then arms, then names off the roster. Their minds weren't spared either. The toll was not just physical. You watched friends die, sometimes screaming, sometimes praying, and you had to keep marching, keep smiling. Some men talked to shadows, others stopped talking altogether. By the time the lucky ones returned home, they were strangers to their families and to themselves. Long marches and freezing nights didn't just test their bodies, they shattered them. Yet somehow, this crucible forged the very spirit of the Ironmark warhost. Men were broken down to raw sinew and stubborn will, and from that ruin, the fire of the Ranger burned brighter. But war wasn't just a grind of body, it was a darkness of the mind. Few Rangers knew why they fought. Most had never seen a map. Orders came from men whose names they couldn't pronounce. They fought for crown and cause, but many had never even seen the king. These were sons of cobblers, blacksmiths, and barley farmers. Letters? Unknown. Geography? A mystery. Their universe was bounded by their home village, their lord's orders, and the man beside them in the trench. To the Rangers, the world beyond the next valley might as well have been another planet. To the average Stormark Ranger, the reasons for war were foggy at best and irrelevant at worst. Dynasties feuded, banners clashed, and old men with rings on their fingers argued in castles, but the man with a bow in his hand didn't understand why his boots were soaked in someone else's blood. Loyalty to Lord Hadric? Sure. Reverence for the High Crown? Maybe. But the real reasons? They were buried beneath politics, greed, and history books they'd never read. Most fought because they had no other path. War was a job, one that offered food, coin, and a chance to escape famine or landlessness. The Ranger's world in battle was tiny. The muddy square around his boots, the thudding heartbeats of the men beside him, and the glint of an enemy's blade across the field. Strategy? That was a ghost in the wind. Orders to charge or retreat often made no sense. Why here? Why now? Why them? Questions with no answers. This confusion birthed chaos. The field of war was a puzzle with missing pieces, a game they played blindfolded. Gossip ran wild. Men whispered of cursed hills, omens, phantom lights in the sky. Some believed the moon's color predicted death. Others swore they'd seen ravens carry messages between armies. When swords couldn't explain what was happening, superstition filled the void. The supernatural lived beside them. Strange wind before a fight, a witch's curse, sudden silence at dawn, the gods were watching. Each man had his own ritual, a charm stitched into his cloak, a bone talisman, a worn prayer. They didn't just fear death from blade or fever, they feared the unknown, the mystical. And that fear sat heavily on their backs. Sleep came in short bursts. Each dawn could bring a new march or a fresh slaughter, and not knowing which made rest nearly impossible. Anxiety stalked the campfires like a wolf. What would tomorrow bring? Arrows, starvation, or silence? This kind of mental wear crushed even the strongest. The body could adapt. The mind? It cracked slowly. Sure, a few seasoned rangers understood the broader scope. They'd read maps, served under multiple lords, and could sniff the wind for shifting tides. But they were rare. Most were tools, pulled and fired like arrows. They were moved by hands they'd never see, pawns in a vast war table game where the rules were never explained, and that powerlessness gnawed at them. Food, the fuel that powered their limbs, was another daily torment. In the perfect world of dusty ledgers and royal promises, each ranger was entitled to solid rations, barley loaves, salted meat, a jug of ale, perhaps cheese or beans. In reality, the carts often never arrived. Bandits struck supply lines, roads turned to mud, food spoiled. What came through was often mouldy, rancid, or crawling. Bread turned green, salted meat so hard it needed a hammer to crack, ale that soured in the sun, and worse weeks passed with nothing at all. Hunger turned stomachs inside out and made even rats look edible. They scavenged like wolves. Nearby hamlets trembled when soldiers approached. Chickens vanished. Cabbage patches were raided. Sometimes livestock was taken. Sometimes families were left weeping. To the locals, the Stormark Rangers were no better than the enemies they fought, and when the villagers fought back, things turned brutal. Throats slit in the dark, barns burned. The rage went both ways. Hunting helped when they could manage it. A rabbit here, a bird there. But the forest couldn't feed an army. Most nights, dinner was a pot of mystery stew bark, roots, and whatever moved slower than a ranger. Hygiene? None. Cauldrons never cleaned. Water drawn from swamps. Cooking fires shared between soldiers and flies. Starvation didn't just make them weak, it made them dangerous. Hungry men became desperate. Morale cracked. Commands were questioned. Fights broke out. A soldier who starved too long didn't march into battle, he stumbled into it. Wounds refused to heal. Fevers raged longer. Death waited just beyond the empty bowl. The commanders knew the problem. They understood supply was the army's Achilles heel, but knowing wasn't solving. So they gave speeches, threatened punishment, promised coin. All while the Rangers tightened belts around empty stomachs. The war, they learned, wasn't just fought with blades, it was fought with hunger. But through this bleakness, one light remained. Each other. Brotherhood wasn't a slogan. It was a lifeline. The Rangers weren't solo hunters, they moved in packs. Each unit was led by a seasoned captain under contract from a high house. These men recruited locally neighbors, cousins, farmhands who knew each other before the banners flew. That mattered. Familiar faces kept you sane. They trained together, bled together, wept for fallen comrades together. In combat, each man had to trust the others blindly. A misfire in a volley could kill your friend. A moment of panic could collapse the entire line. Solidarity wasn't idealism, it was survival. After battle, they weren't just fighters, they were mourners, caretakers, and storytellers. They cleaned wounds with dirty rags, dug shallow graves for those they'd shared jokes with days earlier. They passed around crusts of bread, sang raunchy songs about tavern girls, and whispered stories of home of wheat fields, loud wives, and the smell of warm stables. These moments stitched the tattered soul back together. And there was laughter too. Crude, brash, sometimes dark but vital. Humor was armor against despair. The veterans taught the younger ones how to survive, how to hide from a scout, how to patch a cut with pine resin, how to play dead until the fighting passed. This wasn't official training. This was oral survival gospel passed from cracked lips. Cowardice, betrayal, those were sins. A man who fled in battle was cursed, sometimes beaten, sometimes exiled. Trust was sacred. The battlefield demanded it. And in those eyes of fear and fire, a ranger had to know his squadmate would not falter. The Brotherhood held them up when everything else tried to knock them down. They weren't just soldiers, they were a tribe of fire-blooded survivors, bound by agony and loyalty. Even as death circled them in shadow, they knew they could count on the man beside them. And in that truth, they found just enough strength to survive one more night. The battle bond of the Stormark Rangers was no fairy tale of chivalry, it was forged in blood and terror, a fierce alliance born not from love, but from survival. This unity didn't just help them defeat foes, it helped them conquer the enemy within, fear, fatigue, and despair. That unspoken connection sharing food, death, and silence was the light in a world steeped in darkness. It turned scattered mercenaries into a war-forged engine of death, and it scarred their souls for life. After a brutal skirmish or an endless march, the flicker of a campfire wasn't just about heat, it was hope. It signaled a moment of safety, a pause in the madness. But even this fragile comfort was wrapped in danger. Fires were closely watched. A stray spark could ignite tents soaked in oil and hay, consuming everything. So fires were restricted, small, and regulated like gold. Even light became a tactical liability. Still, fire served its purpose. A kettle of grain, some stew over glowing embers, a warm meal meant life, especially in the ice-crusted north or the wet plains of enemy territory. The smoke, the hiss of cooking, the scent of roasting scraps gave the illusion of home. Rangers, cloaks, soaked and fingers stiff, huddled around flames to dry their boots and warm their bones. In the cold season, the fire was salvation. But fire also attracted death. Its light was visible for miles. Scouts, raiders, or worse, could see the glow and mark the Rangers for ambush. So sometimes they dug pit fires or cooked behind fallen trees or rock walls. Secrecy always overruled comfort, And firewood? A priceless commodity. Rangers often crept miles from camp, axes in hand, just to find enough fuel, risking arrows from hidden enemies with every step. Yet despite the risk, the fire was sacred. It pulled tired warriors together. Around its glow, they became human again. Stories flowed, some ridiculous, others heartbreakingly real. They rolled dice, sang old hunting songs, even mocked their officers when no one else was listening. Around the fire, they remembered how to laugh. In that flickering circle of warmth, the Brotherhood came alive. These weren't just comrades, they were lifelines. Shared suffering made loyalty a reflex. Betrayal was rare and punished severely. Cowards didn't last. You either stood with your unit or died alone. Training bonded them, but survival sealed that bond. When the arrows flew, they didn't flinch because they trusted the men at their side. Discipline wasn't shouted, it was lived. Every man knew his place, every arrow had its rhythm. The Stormark Rangers didn't fire at will, they fired in storms. Coordinated volleys that darkened the skies and shattered charges. Each man listened for the signal, pulled with perfect timing, and loosed death in waves. It was a deadly dance they drilled for years. But marksmanship was only part of it. Rangers became battlefield tacticians. They scanned hills, counted wind shifts, watched shadows for hidden paths. High ground meant dominance. Trees, ruins, pits, all could be used as cover or traps. Their commanders taught them to build barricades, angle stakes, and read terrain like a thief reads locks. The right position could win or lose a war. Each ranger was both sniper and swordsman. The longbow was their first weapon, but it wasn't their only one. If battle broke down into chaos, they reached for axes, short blades, or hook-hilted daggers. They weren't knights, but they could gut one if they got in close. Their equipment was crafted with care, bows made of black yew, arrows fletched with crow feathers, heads forged in iron for armor, piercing or bone-shattering impact. Some made their own arrows, others bartered, but every tool was maintained like a sacred relic. The string waxed, the grip wrapped tight, the shaft straight. A single flaw could mean death. Mental strength was the final piece. Training hardened them, but it was experience that made them unshakable. When arrows screamed through the air and comrades fell beside them, they had to breathe steady, listen, and shoot. Panic meant doom. But with every battle survived, they grew colder, sharper, better. They became creatures of precision and silence, not because they lacked fear, but because they controlled it. They weren't alone either. Their survival hinged on coordination infantry shielding them from cavalry, rangers covering infantry from a distance. The battlefield was a beast with many limbs. If one failed, the rest died, but when it moved in harmony, it devoured everything. For the ranger, survival wasn't about luck. It was about preparation, skill, and grit. Tactical instincts weren't a bonus, they were life itself. Every sunrise survived was a victory. So let's cast aside the myths. There was no glamour in their world, only cold steel, wet nights, and backbreaking marches. To be a Stormark Ranger meant enduring frostbite, stomach rot, grief, and exhaustion, not for glory, but because they had no other choice. Behind the heroic tales of victories at Daggerhearth and Stonecross lay an ocean of unseen suffering. It was not shining armor but mud-caked boots, not cheers but screams, not fate but fire-forged will. These men, cloaked in hardship, carried the kingdom's weight on their cracked shoulders. Their longbows weren't just weapons, they were burdens, heavy, demanding, and cruel. And yet, in their calloused hands, they became instruments of legend. If this glimpse into the life of these unsung warriors gripped you, follow us. We'll keep exploring the darkest, rawest, and most incredible corners of medieval warfare. Because history isn't just dates and kings, it's blood, bone, and the men who never got to write it.